Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining my presentation about bridging constructions in Muyu narratives. First, I give a short outline what this presentation will be about. I will talk about the Muyu language and the corpus I've used, and then the main part of the presentation is divided into two parts. Part one is about bridging constructions in general. I will first introduce the notion, then formulate the research question one, then talk about methods and the quantitative results, and then the part two is dedicated to serial verb constructions. I first introduce serial verb constructions, and then I relate bridging constructions and serial verb constructions in Muyu. Then I will formulate research question two, give methods and quantitative results, and in the end, I will give a short summary and a conclusion about my findings. So first to the Muyu language. The Muyu language is a language of West New Guinea. That's the Indonesian part of New Guinea. You see here on the map, this orange area, that would be where the Muyu speaking villages are. It's said to be a Trans-New Guinea language, or more precisely a lowland Oc language. And there are estimated 2,000 speakers now, and there's no transmission to children. My corpus is part of an ongoing documentation project, which I'm doing for my PhD, and this research is funded by ELDP. Currently, I have recorded 10 hours of video and audio, and 6 hours of them are transcribed and translated. The subcorpus I've been using for this study is only 13 narratives. That's roughly 70 minutes. So part one, bridging constructions in Muyu. Bridging constructions is a notion which is quite recent. A recent volume by Guerin subsumes two well-known linkage types under this notion. First, recapitulative linkage, which is better known as tail-head linkage to Papuanists, and the second type, summary linkage. The first is tail-head linkage. This connects two discourse units by repetition. And we can say that the final part of one unit, which is called the tail, is repeated as the beginning of a new unit, which would be the head. And this pattern of linkage is commonly found in Papuan languages, as most notoriously described by De Vries, 2005. The other type, summary linkage, connects also to discourse units, but not by sheer repetition, but by use of an anaphoric predicate. That could be a light verb or a generic verb or a demonstrative verb. So both types are present in Muyu narratives, and that's why I've been using the term bridging constructions. Here our first example would be, she came and called the father who was picking fruits. She called, but he didn't hear her, so, and so on. So this verb here, the underlined part would be the tail. That's bambaun, called several type, and this is exactly what is repeated here at the beginning of the new discourse unit, bambaun, without any alternation. That's a classical example for tail-head linkage here. On the other hand, for summary linkage, we need to mention the discourse context first. So in italics, that would be the previous discourse. When we were in 4th grade, all the teachers who were teaching us went to study in Merauke at the KPG. And then we have two utterances here. Subsequently, first they did like that. There were no more teachers in our village here. It became like that. Then my father told me. So we have two times this verb here, okun. Okunip would be with third plural subject marking, they did like that, and okunon would be with an expletive subject, it became like that without any entity it refers to. Third singular masculine is only the default choice here. But nonetheless, both verbs here are a clear example of summary linkage. So now to research question one. Research question one is, what does the distribution of bridging constructions in Muyu narratives look like? And this is a rather complex question, so I've split it up to 3 sub-questions. Question 1a, what is their overall frequency and how common are they? Question 1b, which linking type, either tail-head linkage or summary linkage, is the dominant one? And question 1c, is there a change in distribution between the beginning and the ending of a narrative? So as for the method, I did the following. I annotated my corpus here with elan. I've used these symbols here to annotate tails, heads, and the demonstrative verbs, so THL tail, THL head, and SL. Then I counted all pairs of tails and heads and all summary linkages. And then I've split the narratives into halves and related the numbers of occurrences of the types for each half. And I did that to roughly account for the beginning and the end of a narrative. I did not divide them further because further division would need qualitative research by looking at which episodes stick together, and I didn't do that here in this study. So for the quantitative results, the total corpus comprises of 775 utterances, of which 361 are involved in bridging constructions. And that's roughly 47%, or in words, almost every other utterance of our corpus is involved in some kind of bridging construction, which is quite high, I guess. When we split them up to the 13 narratives, we see here from 1 to 13 that the orange bars that are the utterances in total in this narrative, and the red bars are the utterances which have some kind of bridging construction in them. The line above here is the rate, the rate how many percent of the utterances involve bridging constructions. And when we look here at narrative 10, this would be the narrative with the highest rate. Over 70% of all utterances have bridging constructions in them. And compared to the least frequent narrative here, we have narrative number 13 has also still a quite high rate. That's over 30% of all utterances have bridging constructions. That's roughly 37% here. So still every third utterance has a bridging construction. Now to the half splits. The left part is the first half, the right part is the second half. The orange bars are tail-head linkages and the red bars are summary linkages. And when we compare here both halves, we see that the number of tail-head linkages slightly decrease from the first half to the second half, and the number of summary linkages slightly increase here. But what we see nonetheless, the tail-head linkage remains the dominant one. So we can clearly say that tail-head linkage is dominant in Muyu. So part 2, serial verb constructions and bridging constructions. Muyu frequently serializes verbs inside one clause, which is also known as serial verb constructions. The argument, index, and term marking, or the complex morphology, is always on the last verb here, and the previous verbs are only bear stems here. So 2 examples. I called my brother and told him would be call and tell. And let's look for other foods and then go home. Look for and go. And we see in both cases here the subject, index, and also mood marking imperative here is on the last verb. The features we find for Muyu serial verb constructions is verbs are clearly distinguished from nouns as a word class, and each verb can also occur independently, so in a single predicate in other instances. There are no linking elements between the verbs. They share subject arguments, and there is shared tense aspect and mood marking. And all of these features are typically found in the SVC literature. I've just named here a few, but there's many more of them, and that's the most basic features you can get for SVCs. When we look at bridging constructions in relation to serial verb constructions, it's surprisingly little information in the literature about this phenomenon, both in the SVC literature and in the bridging construction or tail-head linkage literature, but we need to take two assumptions from the literature seriously if we look at SVCs and bridging constructions. And the first one would be the claim that tail-head linkage is a matter of clauses. That's found in de Vries 2005 in his famous definition of a tail-head linkage. And that means that the tail consists of a clause, and this clause is repeated in the head. And assumption number B, the claim that SVCs are repeated as a whole. That's found, for example, in Eichenwald 2018. And we need to add one more premise for a logically sound argument, because those two are related. To make a logically sound argument, we would need to include here SVCs are monoclausal. So THL repeats a clause, SVCs are monoclausal, therefore SVCs are repeated as a whole. So if this line of argumentation holds, we should not find too much variation with SVCs and bridging constructions. All the verbs of the tail should be repeated in the head. So, but what we find when we look at different examples in Muyu is that this is not the case. The first example I give here, so example number 3, is indeed an example where all the verbs from a tail are repeated in the head, and this is full repetition. So we see here, she brought the dogs, take and go. She brought them and then she. So in the head here, also take and go, just like the tail. But our second type here, in this example, she took the fruit and showed it, she showed it and then she. So we find in the tail two verbs, take and show, but only one verb in the head. And I didn't find a name for this type, so I labeled it myself, and I'd like to call that tail splitting, because the tail here is split and only parts of it is repeated here in the head. The opposite of tail splitting would be head expansion. And the name is telling, so when the tail can be split, the head can be expanded. In this example, we see, so I went back into the house. I went into the house and sat, and then. The tail has here a noun, house, and only one verb. So this is not a case of serial verb construction, but a simple predicate, enter. And here, in the head, we repeat house as well, the noun, then enter, and sit. We add sit, and in the head, it becomes a serial verb construction. So the head is expanded compared to the tail. And of course, as a last type, the fourth logical possibility would be that both tail splitting and head expansion occurs. And indeed, we find this in the corpus. For example, here we climbed up and took only the clothes. We took only the clothes and went to take a shower, and then we did it. So in our tail, we have again a noun and take as a verb, no serial verb construction, and a serial verb construction with climb here, climb up and take the clothes. And this climb is split from the tail and not repeated in the head, but the head is expanded here with go and take a shower. And this would be a serial verb construction, and this would be a serial verb construction. Here a tail split, here a head expansion. So both types at once. Research question 2. Does the quantitative distribution of serial verb constructions in tail-head linkage justify the two assumptions? Just to remember, the units of tail-head linkage is the clause, and serial verb constructions are repeated as a whole. Those were the two assumptions we need to verify here. And again, we can separate two sub-questions for this research question. First, are serial verb constructions mostly repeated as a whole? And question 2b, what are the relative frequencies of full repetition, tail splitting, and head expansion? So as for the method, of course, according to bridging constructions, I've only looked at tail-head linkages because in summary linkage, there's nothing going on with serial verb constructions. Then I classified each tail-head linkage as either tail split, head expansion, or both of the above, or full repetition of the serial verb constructions. And then, of course, I counted all the occurrences of the types above. So now to the quantitative results. In our corpus, when we when we count tails and heads, we find 173 tail-head linkages, and 84 of them involve serial verb constructions. So if there is no serial verb construction, neither in the tail nor in the head, of course, there's none of these types apply. But in 48.5%, there are serial verb constructions. And when we look at the types here, we find that the most frequent type is head expansion. So 45% of all tails are expanded in the head. Then we have tail splits with 29%. Then full repetition, that's the type which is claimed to be the common case. And in 10%, we have tail split and an head expansion. So what we find here is that the full repetition is rather low compared to altering either tail or head. So to summarize, so when we want to answer our detailed research question, we can find the following. Bridging constructions in Muyu narratives are present in almost half of all utterances, which is quite high. They are predominantly tail-head linkages, and they are slightly unevenly distributed. Summary linkage increases in the second half of the narrative, but nonetheless is less dominant. So we could ask why this slight increase in summary linkages happen, and I think it's probably because summary linkage is a post-climatic linking device. You only can summarize what you have talked about before, so you would need a large string of discourse, and then you summarize this. But in this string of discourse, you can have a lot of tail-head linkages. But to verify this assumption, we would need more qualitative research as a next step. Serial verb constructions in tail-head linkage are only rarely repeated as a whole. That's quite clear from our countings. And they are mostly expanded in the head or split in the tail, and sometimes even both. To conclude, what I'd like to highlight is that bridging constructions are discourse strategies that are described for quite a few languages, but there is only little work on numbers. We generally do not know how frequent they are for most languages. So for Muyu, we can say that bridging constructions are ubiquitous, at least in the narrative genre, and that they combine quite freely with serial verb constructions. So tail-head linkage is rather flexible. Muyu does not rely on the clause as unit of tail-head linkage. What we find rather is that we can repeat as any amount of material can be repeated in the head. The speaker is really free to repeat any material. This is also what we find when we do elicitations. It's quite off the point to elicit discourse strategies this large, but we can ask speakers for repeat some utterances, and then they would freely repeat the last verb or the last clause or parts of it. And if we ask about alternatives, they always agree that they are also possible. The flexibility of the amount of material that can be repeated leads to the fact that serial verb constructions can be split or expanded according to discursive needs. And indeed, SVCs in Muyu are generally less tightly integrated than in other languages. We do not find serial verbs that are grammatically one word or phonological words, but they are always separate words. And this is reflected in the discursive behavior of tail-head linkage as well. So Muyu SVCs are rather loose constructions. And finally, although Muyu offers both linkage types, tail-head linkage and summary linkage, it dominantly relies on tail-head linkage only, with a slight increase in the second half of the narrative for summary linkage, but nonetheless, tail-head linkage remains dominant. This is the literature I've used for the presentation here. And then I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for an insightful discussion. Thanks.